Excellent. So as Jenny had indicated, I'm here to give a presentation on employment standards, just a general overview. I'm not going to get into the weeds too much. This presentation is going to be focused a lot on what's coming up in Bill 5. Okay, so just a little bit about this information. It's going to be really focused on 5 pieces of legislation, right? The Saskatchewan Employment Act, the Employment Standards Regulations, the Conditions of Employment Regulations, the Minimum Wage Regulations, and the star of the show, which is Bill number 5, an act to amend the Saskatchewan Employment Act. Now, I do have to give a disclaimer. We have some regulations that accompany the Saskatchewan Employment Act that are still in progress. So my understanding is they've been written, they haven't been passed. And so everyone in this meeting right now should really keep checking back at our website to see when the regulations are ready, because you're going to find that there's some pretty important details in there. Unfortunately, they're a secret until they pass, so I can't really share too much about what's in them, but just please keep that in mind. All right, so we have a pretty hefty lineup today. It'll start with an introduction. We'll do a brief discussion on minimum wage and report for duty to pay, a little bit about overtime, hours of work and scheduling, vacations and vacation pay, public holidays and public holiday pay, employment leaves, where you're going to find the majority of the Bill 5 changes, illness and injury, record keeping and payment of wages, layoffs and terminations, discriminatory action, gratuities or tips, which probably gets the most attention in social media, appeals, and then I'm going to, of course, provide everyone with some resources, and then we have some time at the end for questions or comments. Okay. All right. So we like to start our presentations with just a little bit of discussion about the scope. So employment standards, we deal with things like hours of work, payment of wages, payroll administration, layoffs and terminations, and employment leaves. So within our ministry, we have an occupational health and safety branch. And so they deal with obviously workplace health and safety, right? You've got some guys up high on a ladder and you want to know if you should have fall protection, they're going to deal with that. They also have legislation with regards to harassment and workplace bullying. Human Rights Commission, they have information on the prohibition of discrimination based on protected grounds. We do as well, but their protected grounds are a little bit different. And then they also have duty to accommodate disabled employees. Again, so do we, but they definitely have the more fulsome rules about that. Service Canada, this is a big one because we get a ton of questions that are really meant for Service Canada on our 1-800 number. Service Canada is going to be able to answer your questions about the record of employment, as well as employment insurance benefits. The CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, everyone's favorite government department, they have the rules about payroll deductions, taxation. They also do investigations into the employee-employer relationship. So, if you've hired somebody as a subcontractor and you're not too sure if they're a subcontractor or not, the Canada Revenue Agency will do an investigation into that for tax purposes. Employment standards will also do an investigation into that for employment standards purposes, but Canada Revenue Agency is definitely kind of takes the lead on stuff like that. And we also have a little bit here on the courts, right? As many of you know, employment standards, we have rules about notice and pay instead of notice. The courts have rules about wrongful dismissal and severance, right? If you have a long-term employee, they have rules about breach of contract. So when you've negotiated a contract that is a lot better than employment standards or addresses things that aren't addressed in employment standards, you might have to go to the courts to get that enforced or to settle any sort of disputes. The courts are important to us because we rely a lot on case law. For example, in the area of terminations, right? As many of you know, there isn't a definition of just cause in the Saskatchewan Employment Act, but the courts have looked at it time and time again. And so we kind of look at their decisions and they inform our decisions. Okay, so part 2 of the Saskatchewan Employment Act. So we just have a few pages in this very long Act. It covers most employees and employers working in Saskatchewan. I believe the number is around 90% if I take what the feds have told us. The other 10% are covered by the Canada Labour Code. By far, where we kind of run into, okay, is it provincially regulated or federally regulated, is in the area of transportation, specifically trucking companies, right? There's always a little bit of mystery around those. Generally speaking, if a trucking company crosses interprovincial and international borders on a regular basis, they are going to be federally regulated. Also, airlines obviously are federally regulated because of where they go. Pipelines, telecommunications and broadcasting. So your CBCs, your radio networks, they're going to be federally regulated. Most banks are going to be federally regulated. The exception to this is some credit unions do fall under provincial jurisdiction. Postal services and some courier services. The courier services part, again, that largely depends on where they go and, if they are actually working for Canada Post. Grain elevators, feed and seed mills, feed warehouses, and grain seeding, cleaning plants. I have a bit of a typo in there. I'll fix that before I send out the presentation. They're federally regulated. A lot of First Nations activities are federally regulated. Uranium mining is federally regulated. All right. And so there are some employees who are exempt from employment standards. So part 2, athletes while carrying out their sport. So for example, if you are a Rough Rider and you are, doing some PR for the Rough Rider team or you're playing in a game, you're going to be exempt, right? But if you're a Rough Rider and then on the off season, you happen to work in the oil field, you are not exempt. Family businesses. So when we talk about family businesses, it's a very narrow definition. Family businesses are businesses where it's only members of immediate family that are employed there. The second a business hires somebody who's not in the immediate family, it's no longer a family business. We have exemptions for traditional farm laborers as well as ranchers. And so these are the ones that are involved in primary production, right? You're working on a farm and you are you're running the tractor, right? You're working on a ranch and you're cleaning out the stables. Sitters and student learners. So sitters, we mean babysitters. Student learners, we mean people who are completing work to fulfill a requirement for their program. We're not talking about, any student who's working, obviously. And we kind of touched on this before, but self-employed individuals or independent contractors who meet certain criteria, they're also going to be exempt from the Saskatchewan Employment Act. So that's when we get involved, right? When people enter into these contractive relationships and, there might be some gray areas or an employee doesn't really understand what that means or an employer doesn't understand what that means, right? The employee might not be getting, the benefits under the Saskatchewan Employment Act when they really should be. So that's when we do an investigation. And then, so this next point is a little bit of a change in policy for us. We'll only investigate complaints from unionized employees if all of their processes have been exhausted and there's some very special circumstances in play. I mean, the idea of this is that, unionized employees, they pay union dues, right, for their unions to represent them in the event of a dispute. And really, that should be a unionized employee's first go-to if there's ever a problem. I remember when, at the very beginning of my career, when I was working out front, we would have situations where we would have a union rep walk in an employee and say, hey, this person has a problem. Can they file a complaint? And it was always a little bit bizarro. So, yeah. And then just a brief comment here, right? The Saskatchewan Employment Act and regulations, we're minimum conditions of employment. So basically, when an employee starts working here somewhere, right, we set kind of that bottom line, right? Employers need to either meet it or exceed it. They cannot offer less than the Saskatchewan Employment Act and regulations. And let's be frank here, right? With, labor shortages in certain industries, right? Most employers are offering better than minimum conditions of employment because they need a way to retain their employees. All right, so I mean, this next slide's pretty straightforward, but there was a recent change, so that's why I kind of thought I was going to keep it in there. So minimum wage. The rules about minimum wage is that employees need to earn at least minimum wage for each hour or part of an hour worked. The current minimum wage is $15.35 per hour. That went up on October 1st of 2025. If you're ever wondering if minimum wage is going to go up again, just know that every year it's reviewed in the summer, either in June or July. I can't quite remember. And then the increase is always effective on October 1st. Generally speaking, there's a formula. It's contained in the minimum wage regulations as to how the government calculates what minimum wage is going to be. I know that during COVID, that formula kind of went out the window and they were just kind of offering certain increases. That's why we saw pretty round numbers being offered for a while there. So report for duty pay. Most employees must be paid for 3 hours every time they physically report for work. So I underlined physically there. It doesn't apply to employees who work from home because you're already at work. It doesn't apply in situations where, let's say, there's some sort of an emergency and an employer contacts you before you actually show up at work, because you haven't physically gone to work there. It doesn't apply, right? The point of reporting for duty pay is to compensate an employee for the travel to work. Report for duty pay applies even if an employee is sent home early because there is no work, and even if the employee goes home sick, right? So it's the act of reporting for work that triggers minimum report for duty pay, not the reason for the employee going home. And lastly, report for duty pay doesn't apply to situations where the employee has been called out to work overtime. So if you have an employee who's already worked 8 hours, again, there's some sort of unpredictable circumstance, I don't know, sinks leaking, you need someone to go in and take a look at it, right? And an employee gets called out and they're there for 2 hours, they just need to be paid for the 2 hours at overtime. They're there for 15 minutes because it's already an overtime situation. They just need to be paid for the 15 minutes at overtime. So speaking of overtime, that's our next section. So most employees earn overtime, which is 1.5 times the employee's regular rate of pay, that should say, if they work more than 8 hours per day or 40 hours per week. So weekly overtime is reduced to 32 hours if there's a public holiday. And so that doesn't include any hours that the employee works on the stat, right? So if the employee works 8 hours on the stat, that gets dealt with separately. It's just the rest of the week. How many hours does the employee work? If it's over 32, then overtime applies. So employers also have the option to schedule employees for 3 or 4 10-hour days per week. Overtime would be payable after 10 hours per day or 40 hours per week. Again, that 40 hours is reduced by 8, not 10, if there's a public holiday. And so this option for calculating overtime doesn't apply to employees who work less than 30 hours per week. Their overtime is 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. All right, so if you see any slides that have this kind of comparison, that is my way of saying this is a Bill 5 change. This is a big one, actually. So currently, a day is defined as any period of 24 consecutive hours for overtime purposes. So under Bill 5, which comes into effect on January 1st, an employer can define a day as either any period of 24 consecutive hours, right? So the standard definition right now, or they have the option of defining it as a calendar day, so from midnight to midnight. An employer can elect to define it differently for, an employee or a group or different groups of employees. And there's an expectation there that the definition of a day that is being used is consistent. You're not flip-flopping back and forth. And that's just a fairness thing, right? Employees should always know what definition of a day is being used. So I have a couple slides that'll show you the difference when it comes to overtime. So any 24-hour period, yeah, this is a little bit complicated, but just bear with me. So I have an example work schedule there. We're gonna assume that the employee had Sunday off and also Saturday off. So if you look at this example, right, 24-hour period. So from Monday, the employee starts work at 7 a.m., ends work at 3 p.m., right? So 6, right? On Tuesday, the employee works at 7 a.m., ends work at 3 p.m., right? So during the 24-hour period of 7 a.m. on Monday to 7 a.m. on Tuesday, the employee only works 8 hours. There's no overtime payable. During the 24-hour period of 7 a.m. on Tuesday to 7 a.m. on Wednesday, right? You can see on Wednesday, the employee doesn't report for work until 10 o'clock. The employee only works 8 hours. There's no overtime payable. So Wednesdays when things get a little bit more complicated, right? So on Wednesday, um, the employee works from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., so that's 8 hours. But then within the same 24-hour period of 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. the next day, the employee shows up for work again at 7 a.m., right? So the 8 hours that the employee worked on the Wednesday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. are payable at straight time. Now, during the 24-hour period of 10 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Thursday, the employee reports for work from 7 and works from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. So there's 3 hours there within the same 24-hour period that the employee has worked, and it's overtime. So there's 3 hours of overtime there. Then the 24-hour period would restart itself at 10 a.m. on Thursday. So 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. is payable straight time only. That's 5 hours. And then so when you look at the next 24-hour period of 10 a.m. on Thursday to 10 a.m. on Friday, there's no overtime worked. So the 24-hour period resets to 7 a.m. on Friday to 7 a.m. on Saturday. I'm going to be sending out a PDF of this document. I know that that was a lot, especially if you're in a workplace that doesn't have these kind of complicated shift schedules. So I'm going to be sending out a PDF of the of this presentation, and so you can kind of ruminate on that a little bit if you're a little iffy on that, or ask me some questions at the very end. So any 24-hour period, right? Oh, my apologies. Okay, and if you choose to define a day as a calendar day, in that very same example we just talked about, the calendar day is now from midnight to midnight. And so if you look at Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, there's no occasion during the calendar day that the employee works more than 8 hours. So there's actually no overtime payable if the employer in this scenario decides to define the day as a calendar day as opposed to any 24-hour period. If I had to venture a guess, I'm going to assume that most employers um, are going to be switching to a calendar day. There's some where if the employee works like really funky shifts, like the majority of them work shift work, um, you know, early in the day and then later in the day, I venture a guess that they would probably consider staying with the 24-hour period. But for most employers who, run a pretty standard day, I could see them just switching to a calendar day. It's certainly a lot less payroll administration. Okay, so the overtime requirements. So this is the requirement to pay out overtime after 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week, or after 10 hours a day and 40 hours a week. We talked about that already. You can vary those overtime requirements by either negotiating a modified work arrangement or getting an averaging of hours permit from the Director of Employment Standards. You don't have to do both. Um, the modified work arrangement has some conditions. And so if you're able to fulfill those conditions, then that's the one you want to go with because you actually don't have to get approval from the director. It's just a um, agreement between the employer and the majority of the employees, so 50% plus one. Um, Employers and employees can also agree to an overtime bank. Generally speaking, for every hour of overtime worked, 1.5 hours goes into the bank. So it's not banked on a time for time basis. And all bank time needs to be taken or paid out within 12 months of the time it was banked, or within 14 days of the employee's last day of work if the employment relationship is over. Okay, so there is some changes to the modified work arrangement eligibility. Um, Under the old legislation, or the current legislation, I should say, um, employees who work fewer than 30 hours per week are actually not eligible to participate in a modified work arrangement. Um, Overtime is payable after 8 hours a day or 40 hours per week, or they would have to apply for a permit. And so, to remove some of that administrative red tape under Bill 5, employees working less than 30 hours per week can participate in a modified work arrangement. Um, I will say that it's care homes that were kind of the driving force behind this legislation. But anyways, that change has been made. Okay, and so no change here. There are still some employees who are exempt from overtime, and then there's still employees who are subject to special overtime rules. So exemptions, managers, um, if anyone's curious about the criteria that we look at, send us an email or ask the question at the end of this training. Professionals or students learning a profession. So when we say professionals, again, it's a very narrow reading of that term. We're talking doctors, lawyers, doctors in training, lawyers in training, accountants. You might be a professional in your industry. So for example, an IT professional, but that wouldn't actually meet the criteria for professional to make them exempt from overtime under the Saskatchewan Employment Act. Teachers are exempt from overtime. Most teachers are unionized. They have something else negotiated for them. Residential service facility operators, traveling salespersons, paid only commissions, motor vehicle salespersons, employees engaged in mineral exploration north of Township 62, some care providers, some employees working for an outfitter, and some working in the logging industry. So there's special rules for firefighters. There's special rules for ambulance attendants. Ambulance attendants have their own legislation that deals with overtime. Commercial hog barn workers, some oil truck drivers. Part of the qualification for that is what exactly are you hauling? Are you hauling refined product or are you hauling crude? Employees working for an RM doing road construction or maintenance. I believe that we have a lot of RM associated people in attendance, so you'll know all about that. Employees engaged in highway road construction, and of course, unionized employees, they will have a collective bargaining agreement that deals with this issue. All right, hours of work and scheduling. Jenny or Susan, if you think that we need to take a break, please let me know. I know it's a lot of information. Um, just let me know. Okay,
We will.
so perfect, thank you. Maximum weekly hours of work. So a week is any 7 days in a row the employer uses to schedule work. So employees cannot be required to work more than 44 hours in a regular week or 36 hours in a week with a public holiday. So managers are exempt from this rule. But what this means is that if you have a regular run-of-the-mill employee who's already put in their 44 hours during the week, if you want them to work more, they have to agree to it. If they say, no, I've already worked my 44 hours, then you have to accept that. And there's no sort of reprimand, reprisal, punishment that you can take. Otherwise, it becomes an employment standards issue. An exception to this rule is if there is a modified work arrangement or an averaging permit in effect, the weekly maximum of 44 gets changed to whatever it is that the maximum that's actually stated in either of those documents. And we talked about this, employees can't be discriminated against if they've already worked their maximum weekly hours. So work schedules. Work schedules must cover at least 1 week at a time. Work schedules need to be provided at least 1 week in advance. And if there's a change to work schedule, an employer should provide an employee with at least 1 week's notice, unless there's an emergency or if it's something that an employer cannot reasonably predict a week in advance, right? So, for example, there's a flood, right? That's something unexpected, right? Um, Something that's not unexpected is if an employer has a slow season and schedules employees just in case it gets busy, right? At some point in time, it becomes expected that it's a slow season and they're not going to be needed. There's probably a violation there. Okay, so there's been a slight change to work schedules, which is related to the definition of a day for overtime purposes. So work schedules have to normally contain when work starts and ends, or if the employee works shifts, when each shift starts and ends. And it also has to specify when a meal break is going to be taken. We'll talk about meal breaks a little bit later on. So in addition to these rules, so they're still in there, what Bill 5 says is that an employer needs to specify what definition of a day is being used for overtime purposes. There's also been a change here where, and I think it's just more of a housekeeping thing, the Director of Employment Standards may issue a permit to vary the work scheduling requirements in non-unionized workplaces. So there's the availability of a new permit for non-unionized workplaces. Under the old legislation, there was just something about unionized workplaces, which is very bizarre, but now um, there's a permit that you can apply for if the work scheduling requirements don't work for you. All right. So our next topic here is on breaks. Employees are entitled to a 30-minute unpaid meal break within every 5 hours of work. Um, so if an employee is working a 10-hour shift, you can actually schedule the 30-minute meal breaks together. So you can have it at the end of the first 5 hours and the start of the next 5 hours. So they just get an hour, which is totally fine. Employees must be allowed to eat while working if they cannot take a meal break. And so if that's the situation, the employee is working during their meal break, you've permitted them to do so, it does become paid time. And sometimes that pushes you into overtime, right? So be super careful about that. Employers, I kind of think this goes without saying, but employers are required to accommodate employees who have medical conditions, right? If you have a diabetic employee who needs to eat more, you should accommodate them. It also becomes a human rights issue if you don't. So, big misconception in Saskatchewan is there's actually no rules about coffee breaks, and it's going to remain that way. Um, the situation just states that if a rest break is voluntarily provided by the employer, so you get 15 minutes for a smoke break in the morning, 15 minutes for a smoke break in the afternoon, that time does become paid time. It's work time. So varying the meal break requirement. So currently, there's actually no provisions that allow an employer to vary the meal break requirement. Um, we got very few complaints about this as well, but it's been cleaned up a little bit, and so now there's also an option for employers to obtain a permit from the Director of Employment Standards if the workplace isn't unionized, or if the workplace is unionized, an agreement can be made between the employer and the union. Um, a situation that I ran into was there was an employer who had a special situation where employees would sometimes be required to work through the night. And it was just, on the odd occasion, right? And the employees didn't want to stop to take a meal break because they're like, then we're just going to have to work an extra half hour at the end, right? The employer said, you know what, my employees don't want a meal break. Well, no, now there's a permit that they can apply for. Okay, we have another change here. It's just a little one. It's just a bit of a clarification. So under the old legislation, employees are entitled to 8 consecutive hours of rest in any day. And so this has to do with the change of a definition of a day. Employees are entitled to 8 consecutive hours of rest in any 24-hour period, even if the employer has chosen to define a day as a calendar day for other purposes. So we just want to make sure that employees are getting a good rest period within every 24 hours. Oh, I'm shooting a lot of changes at you at once, so my apologies. Days of rest, and so this one really just applies to the retail industry. Employees, okay, so normal employees who work 20 hours or more in a week get 1 day off every 7 days. And then the exception was in retail operations, employers with 10 or more employees working 20 hours or more per week get 2 consecutive days off every 7 days. And then the regulation said that one of these days needed to be a Saturday or Sunday whenever possible. And so under Bill 5, the retail workers now just fall under the regular days of rest rules, right? Employees who work 20 hours or more per week get 1 day off every 7 days, including those in retail. All right, so our next topic here is vacations and vacation pay. Not much has changed here. So When I talk about vacations and vacation pay, I don't know if this is going to help anyone out. I always talk about them as being two different things. Like it helps me keep things straight in my head. So as far as time off, employees are entitled to 3 weeks of vacation after completing 1 year of employment. These are 3 calendar weeks. And then they get 4 weeks vacation after completing 10 years of employment. So you'll notice that when I talk about the 3 weeks vacation, right, after completing 1 year of employment. So it's not to say that the employee isn't earning vacation pay during that first year. It's just that the rules say that, an employer doesn't have to give vacations until the employee goes into their second year, and then they get the holidays that they've earned in their first year. In the third year, they get the holidays that they earn in their second year. In the fourth year, the holidays that they earned in the third year, so on and so forth. A lot of employers will give out holidays sooner. Some employers will let you take holidays the year that it's earned, which is okay. It's just better than employment standards, right? But the bare minimum is the employees start getting 3 weeks off after they finish 1 year of employment. So employees have the option to take their vacations all at once or in 1 week periods at a time. Of course, there are situations where employees may be taking an hour here, hour there. That's fine, so long as it's being calculated properly and the employee is in agreement. Employees and employers should work together to decide when vacations are going to be taken, right? So it is a joint endeavor here. At the end of the day, if an agreement can't be reached, an employer still has the right to give the employee 4 weeks notice and indicate when they're going to take their holidays. But of course, that's not our preference, right? Everyone should just work together. Okay, and then separate from this is the matter of vacation pay, right? So vacation pay is calculated as 350 seconds. It works out to 5.77%. Please do the 2 decimal places if that's what you use, of the employee's total wages earned during every year of employment. And then so after the employee has completed 9 years of work, they begin earning 450 seconds or 7.69% of their total wages earned during every year of employment. Okay. And so before I'd indicated that, okay, employees don't get to take their holidays until their second year of work, right? This is just clarifying that in that first year, during every year of employment, right, is what it says, they are still earning vacation pay. So, for example, right, if you have an employee who is terminated after working 3 months, right, they probably haven't taken any time off, but they're still going to have earned some vacation pay on that 3 months, right? Whatever they earned in that period of time at a rate of 5.77%. The Act specifies when vacation pay needs to be paid out. So there's 3 occasions when vacations are taken. If no vacations are taken within 11 months of earning the vacation pay. So for example, if an employee works 1 year and then in the second year, the employee and employer talk, and the employee's like, you know what, I need to put away some money. I really don't want to take holidays. And the employer's like, okay, and is okay with essentially paying out 3 extra weeks of work, right, every year. Within 11 months of that 1 year mark, when they would have earned their 3 weeks of holidays, is when that vacation pay needs to be paid out. And the other option is within 14 days of the employee's last day of work, right? So before we kind of talked about the employee who worked the 3 months and then was terminated or had quit, within 14 days of that date of resignation or termination, vacation pay earned that hasn't been used yet needs to be paid out. Okay, so public holiday pay, not to be confused with vacation. There are 10 public holidays in Saskatchewan. There they are. I think we are among the provinces with the most public holidays. There's some special rules for a few of them. They don't come up very often, but when they do, we get a lot of phone calls about them. So New Year's Day, Canada Day, and Remembrance Day, if they fall on a Sunday and the employer's business is normally closed on Sunday, it gets moved to the Monday. It doesn't get moved if the employer's business is normally open on a Sunday, then it just stays on the Sunday. Canada Day is actually governed by the Federal Holidays Act. And so the Federal Holidays Act says that if Canada Day falls on a Sunday, then it gets moved to the Monday, and we just go with that. I don't think I have this in any of my slides, but an employer can also apply for a permit to move a public holiday. Just make sure you give us some time. Don't apply for a permit, during the week that the public holiday the week before the public holiday happens, we need a little bit more time to process it, right? It's got some layers of approval to go through. So, okay, so there's two kinds of public holiday pay in Saskatchewan. The first one is one that we actually get a lot of complaints about, which is we call it regular public holiday pay. This is calculated as 5% of the employee's earnings, not including overtime, in the 28 days before the public holiday. So you go back to the day before the stat, count back 28 days, that's the period, add up what the employees earned, not including their overtime, times it by 0.05, and that gives you your public holiday pay. It's going to work out to what the employee normally works in a day. If you get a number that's drastically over or drastically under, you might want to give us a call and we'll try to figure out why. But generally speaking, like, for example, if you have an employee who works 5/8, right? 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, they worked pretty steady in that 20-day period, chances are they're going to be entitled to 8 hours of pay. There's an exemption for hourly pay construction employees. They actually get 4% of their earnings every calendar year, excluding overtime and annual vacation pay as public holiday pay. At the end of the year, if you do a reconciliation, these two calculations are very similar to one another. In fact, we, just by policy at Employment Standards, will use the 4%. If there's really crappy payroll records and we're unable to tell what an employee worked in the 28 days, we'll substitute in that 4% calculation to try to get a reasonable number. And I can't tell you the reason why. There's two different calculations that I don't know. So the second kind of public holiday pay employers need to take into consideration is premium pay. I think everyone knows about this. Employees are entitled to 1.5, their regular rate of pay for every hour or part of an hour worked on a public holiday. So it's calculated the same as overtime, but it's not, it's premium pay. All right, so I thought that I would just include a slide on salaried employees. So these employees that get paid pretty much the same amount no matter what every pay period. So if a public holiday falls on a normal day of work and the employee gets the day off, so the employee normally works Monday through Friday, stat falls on a Monday, the employee gets the Monday off, and the employee's pay isn't reduced, chances are a salaried employee has been paid properly for that time. So now where you might have to do an additional calculation for salaried employees is if a public holiday falls on a day that they normally work and the employee works it. So the employee normally works Monday through Friday, stat falls on a Monday, and they work on that Monday. The employee gets their entire salary, plus they get time and 1/2 for all hours worked. So their entire salary covers them for their wages that they worked, plus the 5%, and then you have to calculate time and 1/2 for all hours worked for the other kind of public holiday pay. And another time when a wage adjustment might need to be made is if an employee, if a statutory holiday falls on a day that the employee normally doesn't work. So let's say you have an employee who normally works Tuesday through Saturday, right? And the stat falls on a Monday, and the employee still comes in on Tuesday that week and it works all the way to Saturday. There's no extra pay there for the employees. So that employee is probably going to get an extra 5%. There's occasions where an employee and employer will agree to just give the employee another day off. So they might get the Tuesday off, and that is probably going to be proper payment. But if that doesn't happen, there's certainly no rule saying that has to happen. Um, if a public holiday falls on a day that the employee normally wouldn't have worked anyways, there's probably going to need to be a bit of an adjustment to that employee's salary. Okay, so employment leaves. I'd mentioned that this is the one with probably the most concentrated changes. So we've separated employment leaves into 4 different categories. There's probably a lot that I certainly wouldn't be aware of if I didn't work here. So we have family leaves, right? Maternity, adoption, parental leave. We have bereavement leave, crime-related child death or child disappearance. Um, I remember when crime-related child death or child disappearance came into effect, and there's actually a section in the legislation that says you can't be a prime suspect. And I kind of thought that would go without saying, but no, it's actually in there that you cannot be a prime suspect if you want to qualify for that leave. We have a number of health leaves, right? Organ donation. So if anyone ever wants to take up that guy with donate a kidney to my son on the back of his truck, guess what? You get a health leave for that. Critically ill adult care and critically ill child care. We have compassionate care leave. Service leave, so reserve force, nomination candidate and public office leave, and we even have a 1-day leave for citizenship ceremonies. And then other leaves, public health emergency, and then there's also an interpersonal or sexual violence leave. So generally speaking, if you're going on maternity, adoption, parental, organ donation, reserve for service, or nomination candidate and public office leave. So basically leaves that you could reasonably predict are going to happen, right? Or that you have to apply for, right? It's not like a something that you would have very short notice about. You have to give the employer 4 weeks notice when the leave will start and when the estimated return to work is going to happen. But there are some exceptions. So the first one is if you don't know, um, if it's not reasonably known when the commencement or date of return is going to be. So I don't know, for the reserve for service leave, right? If a war gets declared in a week's time and you got to go right away, that's probably okay. Um, you don't have to give 4 weeks notice if the leave is for 60 days or less. And with regards to maternity leave, an employee gets to leave whenever they want if they have a medical note stating that, hey, there's a health issue and they need to leave immediately. If an employment leave involves a medical issue, the employee can be required by the employer to provide a doctor's note or other written evidence to verify the circumstances. So for the employers in the call today, it's up to you to ask for a medical note. Uh, And so when an employee is on a employment leave, they continue to accrue seniority, service for vacation or vacation pay, and rights of recall to a maximum of 78 weeks. So for the 78 weeks that they're away at the very least, they would continue to accrue seniority, service, and rights of recall. We state that employees can be allowed to participate in benefit plans. The catch with this is that there's nothing stating that an employer has to pay their portion. You can actually have your employee pay both portions in order to maintain benefits. The point is that they still need the option to participate in a benefit plan. And we have some rules about reinstatement. So employees who are on employment leaves, they're entitled to the same job if their leave is less than 60 days. If the leave is more than 60 days, they're entitled to a comparable job upon their return. Okay, so the first change is with maternity leave. Currently, the rules state that an employee who experiences a miscarriage or stillbirth, they still get maternity leave as long as it happens within 13 weeks before the estimated date of birth. Under Bill 5, miscarriage and stillbirth has been replaced by loss of pregnancy, and they're actually entitled to that leave if that happens up to 20 weeks before the estimated date of birth. So we have a change with regards to bereavement leave. Um, and a lot of these changes are just like a modernization of the legislation. The Saskatchewan Employment Act has been around since 2014, right? Prior to that, it was the Labor Standards Act, which had been around since 79, I think. So um, with bereavement leave, right? Currently, right now, if an immediate family member dies, employees get 5 days of unpaid bereavement leave, starts in the 1 week before the funeral and ends in the 1 week period after, right? So it's a little weird that it's like you will grieve, for this period of time. So to kind of remedy that, right? In addition to an immediate family member, employees can access bereavement leave if a prescribed person dies. So when I say a prescribed person, that's actually going to be in the regulations, which aren't out yet, but it's going to um, expand the eligibility of bereavement leave to other persons. So keep an eye out for that. And it's also expanded to if you're using a surrogate or you're adopting a baby, you might also be eligible for bereavement leave if um, that child passes away. So employees can take 5 days of unpaid bereavement leave within 6 months after the death or loss of pregnancy. So it's no longer, hey, week before, week after the funeral. They can actually take that 5 days within 6 months after the event occurs. right? And this is, again, just recognition that everyone grieves in different ways, right? There might be some cultural considerations. So we wanted some additional flexibility there. All right, so interpersonal and sexual violence leave. Interpersonal and sexual violence, it's different from the other leaves because this is really the only employment leave with a paid component, not including EI. Remember I said at the beginning, we don't deal with EI at all, but this is the only one that kind of has some paid leave associated with it, right? So currently the rules say that survivors of interpersonal violence, or if you're the parent or caregiver of a survivor, are eligible for 10 days of leave in a period of 52 weeks. And so that 10 days is for you or your child to seek medical attention, access supports, relocate, or participate in legal proceedings. The first 5 days are paid time. There's a calculation in the Saskatchewan Employment Act as to how this gets figured out. The last 5 days is up to the employee and employer to negotiate. At the minimum, they just get the time off without pay. And so this 10 days can be taken all at once or broken down into hours or days as necessary. So under Bill 5, in addition to these 10 days, so the 5 unpaid and 5 paid, survivors of interpersonal violence or the parents or caregivers of survivors, they actually get an additional 16 weeks. This whole 16 weeks is going to be unpaid though. An employee can choose to use it separately or along with the 10 days, but the 16 weeks just has to happen all at once, right? So if an employee can't come to you and say, hey, can I take 10 weeks now and 6 weeks later? No, it has to happen all at once. All right, so um, yeah, this is kind of a bit of a downer part of my presentation because next we're going to talk about illness or injury. So my apologies. Maybe I'll try to split this up so it's not so depressing, but illness or injury. So you'll notice that this is separate from employment leaves because the rules are a little bit different, right? Even though it kind of sounds like an employment leave, it's not, it's separate. So generally speaking, job protection for illness or injury, there's some qualifiers, right? In order to be entitled to job protection, you need to be employed for at least 13 consecutive weeks with the same employer. And it's either for your own illness or injury or the illness or injury of an immediate family member who's dependent on them. So if the illness or injury is not serious, the Act provides for a total of 12 days in a calendar year. And those are full days. So if the employee is only away for half a day, that doesn't count. That doesn't count towards the 12 days. It's a full day. All right. So for serious illness or injury, there's a bit of a change. Currently, it says that employees are entitled to 12 weeks of job protection in a 52-week period if there's a serious illness or injury of themselves or immediate family member. If the employee happens to be in receipt of WCB benefits, they actually get increased protection up to 26 weeks in a period of 52 weeks. Under Bill 5, for serious illness or injury, WCB related or not, the job protection is increased to 27 weeks under both circumstances. So a little bit easier to remember, but there is a bit of an increase there. Okay, this one's interesting, medical notes. So COVID, what did we learn during COVID? That it's probably not a good idea to have a bunch of sick people all in the same place at the same time. Also, our healthcare system is very busy. So there's been some new rules put in for medical notes. Before it was very willy-nilly. Employers can require an employee to provide a medical note to confirm that they can't go to work because they're ill or injured or because their family member is ill or injured. Under Bill 5, employers can only require an employee to provide a medical note if the employee is gone for longer than 5 consecutive working days. So the key word in there is probably longer, right? Or the employee has had non-consecutive absences of 2 or more working days in the previous 12 months. And so the key word in there is absences, it's plural. And so to kind of demonstrate what I mean, I have some examples that my lovely coworker in the South thought up. So I'll just go through these real quick here. So the first example, the assumption for all these examples is that the employee normally has Sunday and Saturday off, right? So, and we're just looking at work days. So in the first example, the employee is away Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That's 5 days. They're also away on the following Monday. That's 6 days in a row. The employee is off on Tuesday. Now, because the employee is gone longer than the 5 days, the employer has a right to request a medical note on the Tuesday. The next example illustrates the very little distinction there, right? You have an employee who's gone for 5 days because they haven't been gone for more than 5 days. If the employee is gone on a Monday, you cannot request a medical note. These next ones get a little bit trickier, right? In example number 3, the employee is gone 3 days, then the employee is gone 2 days. So, because the legislation says that you have to have absences of 2 consecutive days or longer in the previous uh, in the previous year, right? Because there's at least 2 absences in here, right? The employee's gone on Thursday, can you request a medical note? Yes. The 4th example is pretty straightforward, I feel like. The employee's just gone for 3 days, you know, they haven't been gone for more than 2 occasions of 2 days or more. They haven't been gone for more than 5 days, so no. And then the last one, the employee's gone for 2 days, worked some days, is gone for another 2 days in a row, worked some days, and then is gone for another 2 days in a row. Can they ask for a medical note? Yes. So hopefully this doesn't come back into, hopefully we don't have to think about this for a very long time, but you never know. There's been some changes about public health emergencies. Under the current legislation, if there's a public health emergency, the requirements to be employed at least 13 consecutive weeks for job protection and the requirement to provide a medical note if requested don't apply, right? You get to go even if you haven't been employed for 13 weeks and um, you don't have a medical note, right? Under Bill 5, there's just a little bit of clarity here, a bit of housekeeping. It clarifies that these exemptions, so the requirement to be employed 13 weeks and to provide a medical note, only applies if a public health emergency is declared by the World Health Organization and confirmed by the chief medical officer, or if our chief medical officer says that there's a disease in Saskatchewan and we have to take special measures, then this comes into play. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Again, I'm hoping that doesn't come up anytime soon. So. All right. My apologies. My PowerPoint is acting up on me a little bit, so. Okay, so I just have a section here on record keeping and the payment of wages. So with respect to time cards, I'm hoping everybody knows this, but you're required by law to keep true and accurate records of an employee's hours of work. It isn't a prosecutable offense if you do not. It does not matter if an employee is paid by the hour, a salary, or some other way. So even your salaried employees who work 35 hours a week, no matter what, you still need to keep time cards because you never know when they have worked more, right? We have cases where employees, you know, are paid based on a salary, based on a certain number of hours worked, and then suddenly there's an event and they end up working more, and the employer doesn't know about it, or the employee doesn't tell the employer about it, right? Until something goes south in the employment relationship and we get a complaint, right? So, um, yeah, it's super important that time cards are kept for absolutely everybody. Pay stubs as well. Employers are required by law to keep true and accurate pay stubs. The legislation says what your pay stub needs to look like. Here's an example. If there's something that's not properly listed on the pay stub, employment standards may deem the wages to be unpaid, right? So unless you can prove otherwise is basically what that means. So quite often we'll see an employer just pay out 8 hours for public holiday pay, and it's just included, lumped in with their regular wages. I mean, if we looked at the records, right, we'd probably be able to tell, okay, the employee got an extra 8 hours. It's more likely than not that that's for public holiday pay. You probably wouldn't earn anything more. What if there's no records, right? And it's not properly listed on pay stub? What if you have an employee who doesn't want to talk to the employer about things? They just look at their pay stubs and they're like, oh, it doesn't look like I received public holiday pay. Let me file a complaint, right? So, yeah, it's super important to properly itemize what category of wages is going to be paid, um, basically to guard against claims that really don't need to be filed. Okay, so timely payment of wages. During employment, all employees must be paid in full within 6 days of the end of the pay period. Most employees have to be paid at least twice per month. Salaried employees are the only exception. If you're a salaried employee and you get paid a monthly salary, then you can get paid just once per month. Otherwise, everyone else needs to be paid at least twice per month. Um, an interesting fact about this is we've decided that an employee getting a mid-month advance does not meet the requirement to be paid at least twice per month. You actually have to calculate payroll twice per month. Once employment ends, employees must be paid all their wages within 14 days of their terminations, layoffs, or resignations. Generally speaking, we don't like to accept complaints any sooner than that. The exception to this rule is if there's a payday during the 14 days, the employee really should be getting their paycheck on that day. And then if you have to do some additional calculations for vacation pay or time bank or whatever, then the rest of it can be withheld for no more than that 14 days. This is more of just formalizing something that we'd always allowed by policy. In the current legislation, wages must be paid in a Canadian currency by check or by direct deposit into the employee's bank account. And so under Bill 5, it just clarifies you can also pay an employee in cash, which is not the same as paying under the table, but you can pay an employee in cash, right? Um, I would recommend that you have some sort of system in place if this is the situation where, you give the employee cash payment and they initial that this is the amount of cash, because what are you going to do? Photocopy the cash? Like that tells me nothing, right? So, you should really, my recommendation is just have some other sort of tracking saying, this is how much cash the employee received on this date. So if there's a complaint, um, there's no dispute over how much the employee received, right? Whereas, normally if you're paying by check or direct deposit, right, there's bank statements, there's cash checks, but not so much here. So we have some rules about deductions an employer cannot make. And again, this is just formalizing some things that we've allowed by policy. So currently you're allowed to take off income tax, EI, CPP, so the Canada Revenue deductions everyone knows about, deductions for saving plans, pensions, RRSPs, the legitimate ones, employee contributions to other benefit plans. So if you're paying, premiums for health plans, that can come off. Charitable donations voluntarily made by the employee. If the employee is unionized, you can take off union dues. And you can also take off that should be voluntary, employee purchases of goods, merchandise, or services from the employer. So under Bill 5, we've clarified or confirmed that an employer can also deduct wage advances. There's always been a bit of a gray area around training, and there continues to be, but this is kind of a very straightforward training situation. So if it's voluntary training that the employee was not required to take by the employer and the employer pays for it, the employer can claw that money back. There should always be some sort of written agreement in effect. So an example of this is, let's say you're working somewhere and you want to get a trade. It's not a job requirement. You don't have to get one. You want to get a trade. And the employer says, okay, we'll front you the money, but you have to pay us back for it. It's like, okay, not a problem, right? So that's an allowable deduction. In contrast, it could be a situation like you're working somewhere and um, the employer gets contacted by OH&S and they're told that you have to go get training on PPE. um, and so in that situation, right, if there's a cost to that course and the employer makes you go to it, it's not a job requirement. Um, it's not something that you have to get when you're hired for the job, right? That's a mandatory course that cannot be deducted. So there's a slight difference there, but really it's voluntary versus involuntary training. And then also housing or moving allowances provided with the consent of the employee. So again, writing is going to be king here, right? Try to have these agreements in writing so that there's no sort of misunderstanding. If you get a complaint, we can look into it, right? All right, so deductions an employer cannot make. Um, Employers cannot make any deductions that should be paid to the employee. An employer can't tell you how you're going to spend your wages, and an employer can't pay you and then ask you to return a portion of the wages paid, right? I recently had a file. Most people probably don't know this about me, but I was an employment standards officer for years and years and years. One of my last files I handled was an employee who actually came over on a work permit. And so the employer had put a rate of pay to get the employee approved for the work permit, um, because there were like requirements about the minimum that you could pay an employee under this category. And then after the employee started working, the pay stubs look okay, it's the right rate of pay. But then the employer went to the employee and said, you know what, you're actually getting paid minimum wage. We just had to write that down on your pay stubs and on your immigration paperwork. We want you to return $2.50 from every paycheck you've had, from every hour that you've worked on every paycheck that you've had, right? So that's unlawful. I collected back for that, obviously, but that's what that means, right? So examples of unlawful deductions. A lot of like dine and dashes, the running away from a pump after you've paid, I can't remember what the slang term for that is, right? Those are safety things, right? We don't want employees running after dine and dashes because that's going to be coming off of their paycheck if they let the customer run away, right? Same with gas, right? If someone leaves a gas station without paying for their gas, we don't want employees running after that, right? Certainly there's been stuff in the news where that hasn't turned out so great. Uniform deposits are actually an unlawful deduction. So there's nothing under the Saskatchewan Employment Act that says an employer can take a uniform deposit off an employee's paycheck. Even if the uniform deposit gets paid back when the employer returns the uniform, it needs to be provided without a deposit if you want your employees to wear a uniform. So required training an employee has had to take after they're hired. We kind of talked a bit about that. Damages to an employer's property or merchandise. And you also can't take theft off. And so the funny thing about theft is even if you're guilty of the theft, like let's say, yeah, you're having a rough time and you've stolen from your employer and you admitted you stole, the employer has to go through court to get that back from you. They cannot take it off a paycheck. All right. So how much time do we have? 2:34. Okay. Layoffs and terminations. So the rules about individual layoff and termination have not changed. So if an employee has been working for at least 13 consecutive weeks, they have to be provided with notice or pay instead of notice of their termination, which includes layoffs, and the amount required depends on how long the employee has been employed. Here's our chart. So it's proportional, right? The longer an employee works, the more notice they need to be provided. Our advice to employers is if you're thinking about terminating a long-term employee, you should really talk to a lawyer, because their entitlements under common law might be greater than what their minimum entitlements are, right? You hear a lot about severance, wrongful dismissal. That's all through a lawyer. That's all through the courts. So calculating pay instead of notice. Um, oh, I'm sorry. I said that there was no change. I guess there is a bit of a change, but it really has to do with vacation pay. Anyways, okay, so pay instead of notice is calculated as what the employee would have normally earned during the notice period. Anybody who's paid out pay instead of notice between 2014 and now will know that you actually had to pay vacation payout on that sum. So under Bill 5, that's been reversed, and an employer is no longer required to calculate vacation pay on pay instead of notice. However, if working notice is provided, vacation pay still applies. So, if you have an employee, you have to terminate them. There's no just cause. You have to pay them out pay instead of notice. You just pay them out what they would have normally earned, and you don't have to pay vacation on that amount. However, if you have an employee and you give them working notice and they actually work some hours, then vacation pay would be payable. And then just a brief slide on just cause. No notice or pay instead of notice has to be paid if an employer can prove just cause for an employee's immediate termination. This is the issue that we probably get the most complaints about. There's no definition of just cause under the Saskatchewan Employment Act. We look at what the courts have said. The way I explain this to employers whenever I had claims is there's really two kinds of behavior that could be just cause, right? There's something so egregious that you have no choice but to terminate the employee immediately. So theft, assault, sexual assault, moonlighting, conflict of interest, stuff like fraud, right? Pretty serious stuff that almost makes the news. That could be just cause. If it's less serious, the common stuff, right? Employee has really bad attendance, employee has behavior issues, an employee has performance issues. In order for that to amount to just cause, you have to show that the employee had received prior warnings, right? That you tried to work with the employee got a final warning saying that, hey, you know, if this happens again, you're going to be terminated, then that could equal just cause, right? So two different kinds of things can equal just cause. And so it is ultimately the employer's responsibility to prove just cause based on a balance of probabilities. If you're not sure if you have just cause or not, my advice is to just pay it out. Certainly no one in employment standards is going to be able to tell you whether you have just cause. We have to talk to both parties, right? All right, so there is a change here. Group notice of termination. So individual notice is something completely separate. Group notice of termination is written notice that has to be given to the minister, to the union, and every employee if a group of employees is being terminated at once, right? So this is different than individual. The notice periods are different. If you terminate a bunch of employees at once, you have to give this additional notice to the employees, the minister, and the union. The notice has to state how many employees are going to be terminated, when they're going to be terminated, and why. I mean, the minister wants to know this stuff is, you know, we want to know kind of the effect a group termination might have on a community, right? At one point in time, they would almost send out a task force to, you know, a workplace. I don't know if they do this anymore just because of resource constraints, but at one point in time, I know that they used to send out a task force where they would like pair up with people who would help employees find a job. Employment standards people would go out there, EI people would go out there and just to help these individuals um, make a successful transition to new employment, right? And so group notice can run concurrently with individual notice. So you can actually issue both at once. So this is something that I can briefly speak to. So under the legislation as it is, group notice has to be provided if more than 10 employees, 10 or more employees, are terminated within a workplace. Under the new legislation, that minimum of 10 goes up to 25, so 25 or more employees in a workplace. Um, I had mentioned that the notice periods go up the more employees are terminated. I didn't write anything in here about it. Currently, it's between 4 and 12 weeks. Um, that's in the regulations though, and I don't know what the regulations are going to say, if that's going to stay the same between 4 and 12 weeks, or if it's going to be increased or decreased. I'm not sure. So watch out for that if you are in the unfortunate position of having to terminate a big group at once. Oh, okay. So our next section here is on discriminatory action. I'm actually on a working group on this section because it's quite a big change internally for employment standards. So discriminatory action is defined as any action or threat of action by an employer that negatively affects an employee's terms of employment or chance for promotion. So basically, it's a reprisal, it's a punishment, right? It includes things like terminations and layoffs, suspensions, demotions. If the employee's pay is reduced, hours are reduced or changed, if the employee is being coerced or intimidated, and then there's this kind of catch-all, right? Any other discipline or penalty. So under the legislation, not everyone can come in and say, I've been discriminated against, right? It has to be based on certain protected grounds. And so there's quite a few of them under the legislation. So an employer cannot take discriminatory action against an employee because they're away from work due to illness or injury, or the illness or injury of an immediate family member. We talked about those rules. Is pregnant or is temporarily disabled because they're pregnant, has requested or taken an employment leave, has asked the employer for their rights, right? So if you go to an employer and you're like, hey, I don't think my overtime's been paid out correctly, and the employer's like, yeah, don't care, you're fired. That's probably a violation, right? Is disabled and requested accommodation, has had their wages seized or attached. A common example of this one is if you are behind on maintenance enforcement and the employer is contacted by justice and told, hey, we need $300 from this guy's paycheck, can't be discriminated against because of that. If an employee's filed an employment standards complaint while they're still employed, which is an option, they cannot be fired. Or if they've made an inquiry, although that one's a little bit hard to prove, an employee can't be terminated for reporting an offense to a lawful authority or being asked to testify. And that could be employment standards related or some other offense, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be related to employment standards. So if an employee can show that they were like there was discriminatory action taken, they were fired, let's say, and it was based on a protected ground, right? They feel like it's based on the fact that they let their employer know they're pregnant. Then the employer has the responsibility of showing that the termination or was for some other good and sufficient reason unrelated to, in this situation, the pregnancy, right? Unrelated to the protected ground. And so, like I said, this is a big change internally for us. Currently, whenever we get an employment standards complaint about discriminatory action, we would try to settle it. If it couldn't be settled, then we would have to refer it for prosecution, and it would need to be a convicting court that would tell an employer, hey, you need to reinstate the employee, you need to pay them back pay, you need to stop the discriminatory action, which kind of goes without being said. So before it was very heavily a court process. Under Bill 5, that authority has been given to the Director of Employment Standards. So now the Director of Employment Standards has the authority to determine if an employer is taking discriminatory action and then can order remedies. And so if the employer doesn't agree, it no longer has to go through the courts first, right? It basically goes through our normal appeals process, where it goes to an adjudicator and then there's a hearing. All right, so I'm going to try to get through these last few slides. So we have times for at least a couple questions. Gratuities and tips. This is the one that I feel like, I don't know, I occasionally peruse the Reddit, and it seems like people are the most interested in tips protection in Saskatchewan. Currently, we have no provisions, right? We don't have any rules about, who has to get tips, if an employer can keep them all or not. So under Bill 5, employers are prohibited from withholding tips, making deductions for them, or requiring the employee to return tips. So if this happens to occur, tips become wages owing, and then we would try to settle the matter, right? First and foremost. But if that can't be settled, then we can go through our legal process. Employers can establish a tip pool. I don't know what that looks like. That's going to be discussed in the regulations whenever they come out. And so the funny thing about tips is that we actually don't have any record keeping provisions about tips. So it's not like, the requirement to keep time cards. We don't have a requirement to keep track of tips, but employers will likely have records some way, right? And if an employer doesn't, then an employee would be advised to keep records. And if there's a dispute, then maybe we go with the employee's records. So no formal record keeping provisions for tips, but obviously there should be something, right? The majority of people pay via card anyways. So if there's a tip, there's probably going to be some sort of paper trail, but just a unique little quirk there. And so as you can see, we don't know a whole lot about tips, right? That was a very short slide. So hopefully more is going to come out sooner rather than later. And then so lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about the appeals process. So just please be aware, this is for the majority of complaints. It doesn't apply to discriminatory action appeals. There's actually a whole separate section that talks about the appeals process for discriminatory action. This is just, an employer is found that they haven't been paying, I don't know, that they owe an employee pay instead notice, or they haven't been paying overtime, or they haven't been paying public holiday pay, and the employment standards officer cannot get the matter voluntarily resolved. Most of our claims, we come up with an amount outstanding, we write a decision letter, and usually the employer pays, right? Or there is no claim, and we write a decision letter to the employee, and the employee accepts it, right? But there's some situations where it just can't be resolved. So if there's been a violation and we can't get a settlement, the Director of Employment Standards can issue a wage assessment. So the wage assessment is kind of the start of our legal process. You're going to get plenty of notice before this happens, because it's kind of a last resort. We don't like issuing wage assessments if we don't need to. The employer must pay the amount of the wage assessment or appeal it within 15 days of the date of service. The employer, if you want to appeal it, you need to have a written notice of appeal and pay a deposit. And an employee also has the option of appealing a wage assessment, right? So employees owed money, they have their own records. The officer didn't use it for XYZ. The employee can also appeal if it gets to this stage. So if the wage assessment is appealed, Employment Standards notifies the Labor Relations Board and an independent adjudicator is assigned to the file. The adjudicator sets up a hearing to hear evidence and arguments. after the hearing, the adjudicator has the authority to accept the wage assessment as it is. They can change the amount owing, or they can completely disregard it and say nothing's owing. And then after the wage assessment stage, again, most files get resolved. There are a few where a party that adjudicator's decision isn't in their favor, they'll appeal it to the Labor Relations Board. If that decision isn't in their favor, they can appeal it to the Court of Appeal. There's been some occasions where employment standards, as a branch, has have to appeal it to the Labor Relations Board, right? If we have a decision from an adjudicator that isn't quite in line with past policies or past practice or with the case law, we'll also appeal it on occasion sometimes. So if a wage assessment is not appealed, if the 15 business days pass and a wage assessment is not appealed, or if the appeal isn't perfected. So let's say an employer hasn't submitted it on time, hasn't paid the deposit within the 15 days, a certificate, which is essentially a judgment, is issued and it's filed with the Court of King's Bench. There's an admin fee that gets levied at this point, and then the file gets transferred to our branch's collection unit for further enforcement action. So our branch's collection unit has a bunch of enforcement tools that an employment standards officer is not going to typically use during the investigative stage. And then, so the reason why I'm talking about appeals is we have some rules in formalizing the process for withdrawing an appeal. Currently, there's no rules. It was a bit like the Wild Wild West. It was up to the adjudicator whether or not, what they needed in order for an appeal to be withdrawn. Under Bill 5, it's formalized. If an employer or the employee has appealed and then they change their mind, they can serve a notice of withdrawal on the director, the adjudicator, if there is one, and any person who's directly affected by a decision if it's a discriminatory action complaint. And so this is conditioned on the fact that it has to be submitted before the date of the hearing. Okay. Oh, I'm
Such a
dying.
big,
Okay.
heavy sigh.
It is. It is. Note to self, I should probably book.
Oh, sorry. I hadn't. Oop, you got muted.
Mute. I
There we
did
go.
not mute. Sorry, Jenny.
I
I did
think
not mute
I
myself.
might have
Oh,
been switching back here. Sorry about that.
no worries. I was just saying that I don't know how many people heard this. I'm going to book myself a bit longer. And I thank you guys for being my guinea pigs. This is the very first presentation I've had to give on Bill 5. Most of my presentations are just on employment standards as they are. So, okay, so we have a bunch of resources available here. Give us a call. We have a 1-800 number that is staff Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Lovely ladies on there. They can answer your general questions. You can pay us a visit in person. Regina and Saskatoon are the one with pretty standard office hours. The other ones, give our 1-800 number a call and just maybe double check on their office hours. We only have part-time support staff there, so sometimes they're closed when you'd expect them to be open. We have a email address that you can email, and it's pretty good service standard. I think they get back to you within a couple days. So employmentstandards@gov.sk.ca. You can send us an email. We also have a website, saskatchewan.ca/business/employment-standards. On the left is kind of what it looks like. You can see that on the right-hand side, there's a guide called Understanding Employment Standards in Saskatchewan. My coworker right now is working on updating that document to reflect the Bill 5. So everything you read in there, today up until January 1, it's going to be based on the old legislation. And then we also, if you look on the left-hand side, there is training in employment standards, which actually takes you to a list of public webinars. My coworker in the South does public webinars quite regularly. I think she also just did her first Bill 5 one. I didn't check today, but that one should be uploaded to the website in case anyone thinks that they need more information on Bill 5, although I should have covered everything she did. So all right, and so we have 10 minutes. 10
And we
minutes.
do have a couple of questions to start with in the chat. Okay, so the first one is, when calculating the years of service, will maternity leave be included or excluded from the calculation?
It is going to be included. All employment leaves do not break service. So if you have an
Okay.
employee who's gone for a year and a half, which is typical, it is included. If you agree to more than a year or a year and a half, sometimes employees go off for 2 years, right? And employers are okay with that. That's going to be included in the years of service.
The next one I have, what if you have, whoops, now I moved my thing. What if you have a policy that requires a doctor's note for missed work due to illness after 3 days, or is the 5 days the minimum?
So the rule is non-consecutive absences of 2 days or more in the preceding 12 months, right? So if it's just a one-time absence of 3 days, not okay. If the employee is away for 3 days, is away for another 3 days, and then is away again, you might be okay to ask for a medical note. And remember, is absence, or remember, it was longer than 5 days, right? So unfortunately, in this case, your policy, as you've read it or you've written it to me, doesn't meet minimum employment standards. That needs to be amended.
And so far, that's all the questions we have. So does anybody uh, want to unmute or put their question? Just feel free to ask Irene. I think Irene also had mentioned that if anybody wants to email you with some questions,
Yes.
here's her contact information. So
Yes.
she is open, to help. But if anybody has anything, please feel free to, because we still have a few minutes.
Yes, feel free to, you know what, I prefer if you gave me a call because I like to talk about things, like just to make sure that I have jurisdiction to answer your question is like the first thing, right? And of course, everything's confidential. Like number one, who am I going to tell? I don't investigate anymore. Number two, I just want to make sure that I'm giving you the best information with the best facts that are available, right? Otherwise, if it's an email, sometimes if it's a complicated situation, we'll spend like 5 emails just trying to get the information down. So yes, please uh, give me a call or send me an email asking me to give you a call. That would be my preference.
And I know
Irene,
somebody had,
oh,
go
okay,
ahead.
sorry. I have a question.
Yes.
So Irene, a lot of times our office will get questions on vacation time and what it means, like when do they, employment standards, up to three weeks, for that. And after 10 years of service, it is 4 weeks.
Hmm.
How do they calculate it on what year they're going to be in? Like if they were going in their ninth year, so let's say they were hired March 1st and they were going in their ninth year, when do they actually start their 10th year? I get that question a lot.
Yeah. So upon completion of 9 years of employment from their actual start date. So the actual start date always matters, even if you use a uniform entitlement date. There's some employers that'll bring all the employees to a uniform entitlement date of January 1, for example, or the start of the employer's fiscal. So it's always based on the employee's actual start date with the business, their first day of work. And so during the presentation, I talked a little bit about how vacation pay is earned every year, but you don't actually get to take it until the following year. You don't actually get to take the time off and get paid for it until the following year. So really what that means for this is when the employee completes 9 years, so really at the start of the 10th year, they start earning 450 seconds or that 7.69, they become eligible for the time off upon completion of their 10th year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that what you expected?
They were just like when they start their 10th year. The question, I think what a lot of employers get confused on is when are they actually starting their 10th year? So if they were hired March 1st,
Yeah.
and 10 years ago, so 2015, or let's pick December 1st in 2015, a lot of employers get confused of, okay, so is it December 2nd that they are commencing their 10th year, or what is the day that?
Oh.
Yeah, that's usually the question that we'll get here.
So last day in February would be when they complete 1 year. And so March 1st of the next year would be the start of their second year.
Yep.
Is that clear?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. Susan, do you want me to send you a chart? I have a visual.
Sure, if you can. I mean, we always
Yeah.
refer all of the clients, call employment standards, for confirmation because they're the
Yeah.
ones, no, of course, we're always saying that. But yeah, if you could, that way I could share that chart with others as well. And we can
Yeah.
send it out to the group here as well.
Because we will be sending out the slide presentation to everybody. So we'll make sure we include that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, I've looked over this presentation like 50 times and there's still some typos, so I will fix it. Take a look at it.
And just so the group is sort of, I was talking with Irene earlier, we will be our new fiscal starts April 1st till March 31st of 2027. We will be planning a one-day employer, I'm going to call it employer kind of conference. It will be employment standards. We're looking at OH&S. We're looking at workers' comp. We're looking at human rights. It's just in the very early stages. So watch our social media or our website for where and when it will be.
Yeah. And I was also mentioning to Susan and Jenny, I have such a long relationship with them. I was telling Susan that she was the first one to welcome me back from my maternity leave, so I always don't hesitate to throw that in my boss's face. But anyways, I was saying that if you are part of an organization, no matter how big or small, and you think that it could benefit from an employment standards presentation, because we have such a variety of virtual tools, I will admit that Zoom is not our forte, but we will do Zoom. We also have Teams. We have GoToWebinar, so we actually have a webinar platform that we do most of our presentations on. But anyways, or in person, right? If you're not too far away, don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask, right? I will work something out. I'm a big fan of like getting out to places that, getting the message out there to people that we would normally miss, I'm in Saskatoon, right? So there's always, a ton of presentations in Saskatoon and surrounding areas. But if I have a chance to reach out to a rural community or an employer in a rural area, even if it's, just a group of your executives or, there's only a few people there, I'm happy to do so.
Great. Well, with that, if we don't have any more questions, I'd just like to thank you, Irene. This was great. I know it seems it was a whirlwind, but there's lots of stuff there. And like Irene said, if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out to her or reach out to us. And just on behalf of Sage Hill and Irene, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Jenny, I'm just going to log off. Thank you very much.
Yes, you're welcome. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, take care.